Nepal, a mysterious country, home to the world's highest mountains and some of the most challenging airports. The approach into the capital of Kathmandu features amazing mountain vistas, but also offers quite a challenge to pilots due to the challenging terrain and weather phenomena. Today, we are going to find out how and why the crew of a Turkish Airlines Airbus A330 did not meet this challenge and wrecked their aircraft while landing there. Welcome to airspace. Before we begin though, let me just quickly remind you that only a quarter of you are subscribed. If you don't want to miss any of my videos, subscribe and click the bell icon. Your support is highly appreciated. In the evening hours of March 3rd, 2015, Turkish Airlines Flight 726 was getting ready for departure at Istanbul, Turkey's capital. The route of the night flight would take it first out of Turkey, then through Iran, Pakistan and India, and finally into Nepal. Soon, the pilots took their Airbus A330 into the evening skies. The most part of their flight would be highly uneventful. Roughly 6 hours later, as the A330 passed through the airspace of northern India and got closer and closer to Nepal, the pilots attempted to contact the controllers at Kathmandu Airport to obtain a weather report. The pilots knew that they would have to expect some fog in the early morning hours, and they were eager to find out whether the thickness of the fog would hinder their approach. But alas, they tried a little too early. For about 15 minutes, no answer was received due to the fact that Kathmandu Airport was not even open for operations yet. Officially, it opens at 6 o'clock in the morning. At 6:02, the pilots finally managed to get a controller on the radio, but he did not bring any good news. The weather report he provided indicated that the fog over Kathmandu was extremely thick, offering a visibility of just 100 meters or 300 feet. This effectively meant that the airport was closed, as it does not offer any precision approaches that would allow for an automatic landing. Precision approaches require certain criteria, such as the ability to place a free and unobstructed beam from a runway to a place in the sky from which an approach can be started. Since Kathmandu is surrounded by mountains, this is not possible. Therefore, non-precision approaches have to be used, which are, as the name says, less precise. It might be counterintuitive that these quote-unquote inferior approaches can be used in mountainous areas when precision approaches cannot. There are multiple reasons for this. On one hand, non-precision approaches can be curved, essentially avoiding terrain a straight beam cannot. On the other hand, as a trade-off, non-precision approaches require a better visibility, allowing one to see the surrounding terrain a bit earlier. But with a visibility of just 100 meters, such a non-precision approach was out of the question. It would have required at least a visibility of 1,100 meters or 0.7 miles. Even then, it would probably have provided quite a challenge. So, the crew decided to halt at the beginning of the approach, hoping the weather would improve soon as the morning sun rose into the sky. The view must have been spectacular, and the pilots had planned their fuel reserves generously. About 50 minutes after entering the hold, the controllers at Kathmandu reported that the visibility had improved to 1,000 meters. This was still slightly below the required 1,100 meters, but the pilots decided that the improvement was large enough to warrant a landing attempt. This was not reckless by any means, as they could just go around if they wouldn't see the runway. And so, the crew initiated the approach. It leads through valleys in a scalloping path and finally aligns the aircraft with the correct approach direction, where the pilots will eventually see the runway. At least, that was the plan. When the pilots reached the point where they should have seen the runway, they saw nothing but grey fog. Diligently, they performed a go-around at that point and climbed back into the blue early morning sky above a white sea of fog. 15 minutes later, the aircraft was again holding nearby. Meanwhile, the captain had informed the passengers and cabin crew about the reason for the go-around and that they would probably try again. The other option would be to divert to Delhi, more than 1.5 hours away. Around this time, a flight attendant came to the cockpit and stated that it would be a huge burden if they actually decided to go to Delhi. Seemingly unperturbed by this, the captain and the first officer obtained the latest weather report, which now indicated a visibility of 3,000 meters, restricted to 1,000 meters to the south. To them, this definitely looked like the weather was improving, and they decided to attempt another approach. But as they flew their final descent, it seemed that the weather was not as good as the weather report had indicated. Outside, all the pilots could see was dull grey fog. Still, they continued. On this approach, they were allowed to continue down to 300 feet above the ground without visual reference. When the aircraft was at 880 feet, the tower asked the crew whether they had the runway in sight. The crew replied in the negative and asked whether the approach lights were on. Tower confirmed and assured the crew that the lights were operating at maximum intensity. When the pilots were close to the minimum descent altitude of 300 feet, they still couldn't see the runway. If they would not be able to make visual contact by then, they would have to go around again. A few seconds before they reached that point, the first officer said, "It will appear if we descend below." When the aircraft's computer called out minimums as the aircraft reached 300 feet, the captain would have been required to either state visual and continue or go around, thereby stating his decision about the continuation or discontinuation of the approach. Instead he said, "Continue down to 300. A few seconds later the first officer said, "Appearing," probably referring to the runway. And it really did appear, but only when the aircraft was at 14 feet or 5 meters above the ground. Startled, the captain disconnected the autopilot and attempted to flare the large airliner, but it was too late. The A330 slammed into the ground at an acceleration of 2.7 g. Its left landing gear was not even on the runway, but off to the left in the grass. The aircraft was dragged to the left by the resistance the grass provided, and soon it was on soft ground with all 3 landing gears. That way, it plowed through the grass and crossed 2 taxiways that fortunately were not occupied. The nose gear collapsed in the process. Finally, the aircraft came to a halt, resting on its nose in the 2 main landing gears. A few moments later, the tower controller radioed in to ask whether the flight had landed. He had not seen what had happened to the A330. In response, the crew stated that they needed medical and fire assistance immediately. The pilots also requested mobile stairs to disembark the passengers, a strange decision when considering that their aircraft had received substantial damage of unknown extent. The fire and rescue team soon arrived, opened the forward door and advised the captain to immediately evacuate the aircraft, which was finally done 10 minutes after the crash. Everyone made it out alive and fortunately there was only one minor injury. So let's take a closer look at what happened here. It's pretty clear that the pilots acted in disregard of one of the cardinal rules of instrument flying. They continued their approach past the minimum descent altitude without making visual contact with the runway or the approach lights. But why? In post-flight interviews, they stated that they had indeed seen the runway at the required altitude, but lost reference afterwards. The investigators did not believe them, however. Their statements, "It will appear if we descend below," and "appearing" were all non-standard and would have probably not have been made if the approach would have been normal. Also, the first officer never called out visual, as he should have after he would have made visual contact with the runway or the approach lights. Additionally, the tower controller himself witnessed that the weather deteriorated again as Turkish 726 was in final approach, but he decided not to disturb the crew with that fact, as he believed they would recognize themselves if they were not in visual conditions at the minimum descent altitude. Another aircraft that was getting ready for departure returned to the gate at the same time the A330 crashed, due to the fact that they were barely able to see the taxiway around them. A soldier stationed at a security post near the runway also stated that he had heard very strange noises, but was unable to see anything due to the thick fog. The strange noises were the A330 crashing just a few hundred meters away from him. A few other factors to this crash were also discovered. 2 days before the accident, another Turkish airline crew had reported that the approach was not coded nicely in the flight management system, and that they had ended up high and to the left of the runway centerline when they approached the minimum descent altitude. And indeed, the coding of the approach path was found to be slightly offset, ending at a point about 6 meters left of the runway centerline. This once again shows that these approaches are not intended to be flown to the ground, relying only on navigation data, but on visual reference too. Also, the Internal Safety Board of Turkish Airlines had long advised to reschedule the flight number 726 to a later time to avoid the morning fogs of Kathmandu, but this advice had never been heeded. But finally, the board decided that it was ultimately up to the pilots to handle such a situation. Had they just stuck to their procedures and performed a go-around when they were not visual with the runway, nothing would have happened. Even if they had seen the runway but lost visual contact later, a go-around would have been in order. Sure, passengers would have been inconvenienced and additional costs for the airline would have been generated, but I would argue that Turkish Airlines would rather have rebooked passengers than having to deal with a crashed airliner. This accident once again highlights the difficult human aspect in aviation. Maybe the pilots were tired after their night flight and subsequent early morning holdings. Maybe they were influenced by the flight attendant's comment that a diversion to Delhi would be a huge inconvenience. Maybe they even thought so themselves. By just bending the rules a little bit, they must have hoped to avoid that unpleasant decision, but ended up in a situation that was much, much worse. The Airbus A330 was found to be severely damaged, and Kathmandu airport had to be closed for several days until technicians found a way to move the broken airliner. It then sat at a nearby ramp for over 2 years, until a crafty businessman bought it in 2017. He and his team cut the aircraft into 10 pieces, moved it to a nearby place and reassembled it there. Today, it welcomes customers as an aviation museum. The founder of the museum hopes that it will give the many impoverished people of Kathmandu the ability to get a glimpse of aviation and its history, and maybe encourage them to one day themselves become pilots or engineers. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe for more interesting aviation stories. See you in the next one.